By the autumn of 1944, the intoxicating rush across France following the Normandy breakout had slowed to a bloody, grinding crawl. In the Lorraine sector, General George S. Patton's Third Army, the spearhead of the Allied southern flank, found itself hamstrung at the end of the longest supply line in military history. The vaunted Red Ball Express was straining, meaning fuel, ammunition, and replacements arrived in trickles, not torrents. The weather had turned, cloaking the Moselle River Valley in a perpetual cold drizzle that churned fields into tank-swallowing mud and grounded the all-powerful Allied air support for days on end. It was a miserable, attritional fight against an enemy falling back on his own frontier, his supply lines shortening, his will to defend the Reich hardening with every kilometer. The on-paper matchup bred a dangerous confidence within the Wehrmacht's refitted Panzer brigades. They were fielding the formidable Panzer V Panther, with its thick sloped frontal armor and a high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 gun that could kill an American tank well beyond 1,500 meters. It was arguably the finest tank of the war. Its crews, often hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, trusted their machines implicitly. They looked with disdain upon the American M4 Sherman, a tank they derisively nicknamed the Tommy Cocker, or Tommy Cooker. To the German Panzermänner, the American approach seemed to be one of crude industrial might, throwing legions of inferior machines into the fray, hoping to swamp a qualitatively superior foe through sheer numbers. This perception, however, dangerously overlooked the evolution of American doctrine. The U.S. Army did not see the Sherman as a dedicated tank killer. That was the job of the M10 and M36 tank destroyers. The Sherman was an infantry support weapon, a mobile fire base designed to work within a vast, interconnected, and lethal system. It was a distinction the Germans, who built their tactics around the supremacy of the individual panzer, were about to learn in the most brutal fashion. The true American advantage wasn't in the thickness of its armor plate, but in the speed of its radio waves. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter felt the familiar thrum of the Maybach engine through the steel floor of his Panther. From his commander's cupola, the world was a narrow, gray slit of mist and dripping trees. His unit, part of Panzer Brigade 111, had been tasked with blunting the latest American push toward the village of Aracourt. For weeks it had been a game of cat and mouse in the rolling hills and dense woods, a perfect hunting ground. His superb Zeiss optics cut through the gloom, turning murky shapes into sharp silhouettes. He trusted his gunner, a hawk-eyed youth named Helmut, to miss nothing. He trusted the 80mm of sloped glacis plate at his front to shrug off anything the Americans could fire at him. They are clumsy, his platoon leader had briefed them. They rely on their numbers, but they die easily. Through the mist, Richter saw it, the distinctively high, boxy profile of an M4 Sherman, nosing around a distant copse of trees nearly 1 kilometer away. It was sitting still, its crew likely hesitant. Its short 75mm gun, a pea shooter at this range. A novice mistake. Gunner, target 11 o'clock. Richter's voice was calm, clipped. AP range 1,000. The turret began its smooth electric traverse. Inside the steel beast, the crew moved with practiced efficiency, a self-contained world of lethal purpose. The German crew trusted the steel of their machine. The American crew trusted the system behind it. But the Sherman didn't open fire. Instead of traversing its turret, it spat a plume of white smoke from its dischargers, obscuring itself from view. Then, shockingly, it reversed, disappearing behind the trees. Richter frowned. This wasn't the action of a fool. It was the action of a scout. The American commander wasn't looking for a tank duel. He had seen what he needed to see, and now he was talking. On his radio, he was speaking a different language of war, calling not for another tank, but for the invisible king of the battlefield, the artillery. Richter scanned the horizon, suddenly uneasy. The silence that followed was heavier, more threatening, than the sound of any tank gun. The silence in the wake of the retreating Sherman was unnatural, a void in the symphony of distant battle. Inside the Panther, the low hum of the engine and the crackle of the FUG-5 radio were the only sounds. Klaus Richter swept his periscope across the tree line, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. The American hadn't run. He had reported. The German crew was a self-reliant island of steel and firepower. In contrast, the American tank was merely the tip of a spear. Its true power held miles behind the lines. 90 seconds. In the U.S. Army Field Artillery School, that was the gold standard, the time from a forward observer's call for fire to the first rounds impacting the target. Richter's 90 seconds were almost up. It began not as a boom, but as a faint, unsettling whisper in the air, a sound like canvas ripping in a high wind, growing impossibly loud with terrifying speed. Helmet, the gunner, looked up from his sight. "Commander, do you hear?" The world exploded. The first shell from the unseen batteries of the 4th Armored Division's artillery didn't land near them. It landed on them. 6 guns, miles away, had fired at different times, so that all their 105mm high-explosive shells arrived at the exact same instant. This was time on target, a brutally effective American specialty. Richter's 45-ton Panther was violently shoved sideways as if by a giant's hand. A deafening clang, louder than any anti-tank round, echoed through the hull as a shell detonated against the turret roof. Inside, steel dust filled the air, and the lights flickered. The periscopes went black with mud and smoke. Outside, the earth around them was erupting in a continuous rolling thunder of dirt, fire, and white-hot shrapnel. The thick frontal armor that could defeat a Sherman's gun was useless against the plunging fire of artillery that sought out the vulnerable top deck and engine grills. They were buttoned up, blind, and utterly helpless. "My tracks! They have torn off my tracks!" came a frantic scream over the platoon radio, followed by a wet, final gasp. The barrage lasted for less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. When the cataclysmic noise subsided, replaced by the hiss of smoldering metal and the soft patter of falling dirt, Richter cautiously opened his hatch. The air smelled of cordite and churned earth. 20 meters to his left, Panzer 312 was a wreck, its left track shattered and spooled out like discarded ribbon. 50 meters to his right, Panzer 314 was burning, a column of greasy black smoke pouring from its open hatches. His own tank was miraculously intact, saved by a shell that had been a near miss. 3 Panthers, the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been neutralized without seeing a single enemy gun flash. Richter stared grimly at the tree line where the Sherman had been. The American tank hadn't been the threat. It had been a set of eyes connected to a thunderous, invisible hammer. "They do not fight us," he thought, a cold dread seeping past his training and confidence. "They simply mark us for death." The Battle of Aricourt, fought from September 18th to the 29th, 1944, was not a single titanic clash, but a series of vicious swirling engagements fought in dense fog and rolling terrain. For Klaus Richter and the survivors of his company, it was a waking nightmare. They were the hunters, equipped with the superior weapon, yet they felt like the prey. Their confidence in their machine remained, but their faith in their tactical situation was shattered. The Americans were everywhere and nowhere. Their presence felt not through direct fire, but through the incessant, terrifying rain of unseen artillery. On the morning of September 19th, the fog was a thick, wet blanket, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters. Richter's patched-up Panther crept forward, part of a cautious probe toward the village of Chateau Salin. The plan was to use the fog as cover, close the distance, and annihilate the American armor at point-blank range, where the Sherman's gun might finally be a threat. It was a reversal of their preferred tactics, forced upon them by the enemy's invisible king. Suddenly, the capricious wind shifted. The fog tore apart like a curtain, and for a heart-stopping moment, the battlefield was laid bare under a weak autumn sun. There, arrayed across a shallow slope less than 800 meters away, was a company of M4 Shermans from Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division. They were caught in the open, some sideways, their thin flank armor exposed. It was a Panzermensch's dream. "Target! Half left! Fire when ready!" Richter roared, the hunter's instinct surging back. Helmet didn't need to be told twice. The Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun barked, a whip-crack sound utterly distinct from the lower-velocity boom of the American 75s. The high-velocity shell crossed the intervening space in an instant, striking a Sherman squarely on its turret side. The result was catastrophic. A flash of white-hot penetration was followed by a plume of fire, then a volcanic eruption of black smoke as the ammunition inside cooked off. 1 shot, 1 kill. But the expected American panic never came. Instead of a clumsy counterattack, the response was disciplined and unnervingly systematic. Half the Shermans immediately fired smoke shells, not at the Germans, but in front of themselves, creating a roiling, instantaneous wall of white that blinded Richter's gunner. The other tanks didn't charge. They began maneuvering, some reversing into hull-down positions, others displacing laterally, becoming harder targets. They weren't trying to win a gunfight. They were buying time. From a ridge 1 kilometer away, hidden M10 tank destroyers, guided by radio reports from the now concealed Shermans, had watched the Panther's muzzle flash. Their 3-inch guns, more powerful than the Shermans, began to speak. A heavy round smashed into the Panther on Richter's right, punching through the 45 millimeters of side armor and silencing it forever. At the same time, the sky began to rip open again. The artillery had been called. Richter realized the horrifying truth. The Shermans weren't the enemy's fist. They were the enemy's nervous system. They absorbed the first blow, located the threat, and directed the division's true killing power. They had willingly sacrificed one of their own to pinpoint the German position. Richter's Panther was the superior dueling weapon, but he was in a duel with a Hydra. He had brought a masterwork sword to a gunfight. As the first 105mm shells began to bracket his position, turning the ground to liquid mud and steel, his only command was one of pure survival. The German counteroffensive at Ericourt bled out in the mud and fog of Lorraine. What was intended as a decisive armored thrust to shatter Patton's flank ended in a catastrophic defeat. By the end of September, the battered remnants of Panzer Brigades 111 and 113 were withdrawn, having been functionally destroyed as effective fighting formations. Klaus Richter's Panther was one of a handful of runners that limped back from the front, its armor dented and scarred, its crew hollow-eyed and silent. They had been bested not by a superior tank, but by a superior system that rendered their own strengths irrelevant. The final tally was a brutal lesson in the new arithmetic of war. Over the course of the battles around Ericourt, the Germans lost over 86 tanks and assault guns, including many of their vaunted Panthers. The American 4th Armored Division, by contrast, lost just 25 M4 Shermans and 7 M5 Stuart light tanks. The kill ratio was devastatingly one-sided. The Germans had sent their finest knights into battle, only to see them dismembered by an invisible army of squires, each directing the blows of a gargantuan, unseen giant. The legacy of Ericourt was a vindication of American military doctrine. The Wehrmacht had built its Panzerwaffe around the principle of the decisive tank-on-tank engagement, believing that a technologically superior machine, crewed by veterans, could dominate any battlefield. The American army, newer to the fight but a faster learner, had built its armored divisions around the principle of combined arms, orchestrated by radio. A Sherman commander wasn't expected to outshoot a Panther. He was expected to identify it, survive long enough to report it, and let the division's integrated network of tank destroyers, artillery, and fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, do the real killing. The Sherman was not the weapon. It was the trigger. As Richter's Panther was loaded onto a flat car for transport, he looked at his machine. It was still a marvel of engineering, a predator without equal in a one-on-one fight. But he now understood it was also a relic. He had been trained to be a duelist, but the Americans refused to duel. They ran a factory of destruction. "We built the perfect sword," he mused to his gunner, while they built the perfect battlefield. The confidence that had once armored the German crews was gone, replaced by the grim knowledge that, even in the world's most powerful tank, you were never more than 90 seconds away from a firestorm you could not see, summoned by an enemy you might never fight.